Hey, everybody, we'll get started in about a minute, just seeing everybody joining here. So we'll let everybody join for another minute or two, and then we'll get started. All right, well, let's kick it off. Obviously, today we're here to talk about the science behind strong customer relationships. And we have an amazing crew here to talk about that with us. First up, we have Ron Friedman, who is an award-winning social psychologist and the founder of Ignite 80, which is a research and development company that teaches leaders in science-based strategies for building high-performing teams. And not only that, but he's written multiple books. His newest, called Decoding Greatness, was actually selected by Amazon's editors as one of 2021's best books. So that's our panelist number one. Panelist number two is Sylvie Wolf. She's Front's Global VP of Customer Success and Solutions, and has more than 15 years of experience leading customer success experience and post-sales teams. I'll be your moderator today. I lead the product team at Front, and obviously super passionate about building customer relationships. So with that, let's get this party started. So a couple quick housekeeping items before we jump in. First is, you'll notice down at the bottom of your screen, you have that Q&A button. We're going to be actually using live audience Q&A at the end of the presentation. So please submit your questions and we'll try to grab them and use them later on in this presentation. Should be really fun, try to make it interactive and fun. The second is, we'll make sure to share the recording in the next 24 hours in a follow-up email with both the recording and some additional resources. So you can look forward to that. Now, let's jump in. Our agenda today, just a quick agenda to sort of orient us for the discussion with Sylvie and Ron. First, we'll be talking about the study overview and findings. The second is we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive into the findings itself. And then, as I mentioned, we'll finish it off with some Q&A. So first off, Ron, can you tell us a little bit about the background and methodology for this research report?
Yeah, so we started off by seeking to answer a very basic question, which is, what is it that customers seek from vendors? What do they want? What do the best vendors do differently? What are some simple actions that any vendor can take to elevate perceptions of their service? And what are some definite turnoffs, some watch-outs, things that people should stay away from if they're trying to impress their customers? And to find out, we interviewed over 2,000 office workers. We looked at people in the US, in Italy, in Germany, France, Spain, and the UK. These are all people who interact with vendors directly. So that was one of our qualifiers. You had to say that, yes, I interact with at least 2 or more vendors as part of my role. And some of the questions that we asked were directed specifically at people who are vendor decision makers. So it's not, in other words, for these particular questions, it wasn't enough to just say, I interact with vendors. We wanted people who actually could control the purse strings, people who make the determination of which vendor to use. Like, for example, on this next slide, you'll see one of our first questions, which was, we asked people who are vendor decision makers, which do you prefer? Do you prefer a service provider who provides excellent customer service, or do you prefer a service provider who offers excellent pricing? And what we found is that by a margin of more than 2 to 1, vendor decision makers say, I want someone who delivers better customer service. Now, if you think about that, that makes intuitive sense, right? Like if you were offered one of two cell phones, one which offers, which is a little bit less expensive, but has shaky service when you have a problem versus one that costs a little bit more and offers you superb service, you're likely going to choose the latter. And that's what we're finding among vendor decision makers. And so what that tells us is that competing on price really only gets you so far because customers value service more. And so if you want to be successful, what you need to do is you need to make a persuasive case that you offer superior customer service, and that service is important. We often forget that customers aren't always aware of the importance of service when they're making the purchase decision. So you need to highlight the importance of service, then beat them on service, and then you are going to win more customers. If you're competing on price alone, that's only going to get you so far.
That's awesome. And you just mentioned this, but everybody talks a lot about having excellent customer service. But what does that actually mean? Like what actually goes into it? Maybe Ron, can you tell us a little about how you went about answering those questions?
Yeah, so this was, I really like this question because what we did was we asked people to think of a good service provider, someone who they have a relationship with, who does a really good job at providing service. And then we asked them, which of these following factors, we had a very long list of factors, and we said, hey, identify for us the top 5 factors that you think explain why this vendor does a better job than everyone else. And then what you see on the right column is we did the same for a poor vendor relationship. So we had these two kind of different questions, but also different frameworks. What's the best vendor doing differently? What's the poor service provider? What distinguishes them from everyone else? And what you see here is, let's focus on the strong customer relationships first. They say someone who responds quickly, is knowledgeable, easy to reach, communicates effectively, and available when needed. And what you find is when you look at the poor customer relationships, there in many ways, they're the inverse. It's someone who's hard to reach, someone who didn't resolve my issue, required a long wait time, went days without acknowledging my message, and required a lot of effort from me, the customer. And so the key takeaway here is that really what it comes down to is availability, being easy to reach, and acknowledging that you received a request. All of those things go far. And if you think about it, these are the elements that really characterize any functioning relationship, right? If you think about what you want from your colleagues, from your romantic partners, from your parents, you want the same thing. You want availability, you want acknowledgement, and you want them to be easily reachable. We want the same thing from our vendors.
Sylvie, does this sort of jive with your experience, on the ground leading these teams?
It definitely does. And it's actually really gratifying to see, as someone leading CX teams, that people are willing to value the experience of working with someone and having a great relationship, even more so than a price reduction. And these are the things that I train my team on, and that I think that we really need to get right. One of the things that this information and the information previously shared about that money often is less important than service tells me that we need to make sure that we're tiering out service tiers and that people are willing to pay for service. And I think that's a really important learning from here. Is service does have a price. There's obviously a baseline expectation, even for free accounts and self-service, that you can't go below. Otherwise, people will not be valuing your product. They won't be valuing what you're offering if you're not able to offer some baseline service options. But each company should also have tiers that allow you to monetize higher levels of service, which also allow you to offer higher levels of service because you've monetized that. Customers see that value. That's proven in this study. You can sell things like premium onboarding, service consultants. Sometimes we'll do premium customer success managers as an additional add-on. And one thing to keep in mind is that while this all sounds great and is an important way in order to be able to drive up your revenue and also be able to service customers in the way that you want, is thinking through what that means operationally for your business. So it's an extra layer of complexity. Do you feel like you can route to the correct rep in the correct amount of time? Can you maintain your consistent messaging by tier? Can you track and prove the ROI of the higher service levels? People are willing to pay for it, but you obviously need to make sure that you're delivering on what you're setting and what you're selling to your customers. And it's really important because in times of downturn, companies often look to downsell their service levels. So you need to be able to really prove out the ROI.
That's awesome. Moving on, one of the things that surprised me as a busy person, like obviously, if I can get the same thing done faster, I'm all for that. So I'm curious, one thing the study showed is that people would say they'll spend twice as much of their own time for the same outcome. Maybe Ron, you want to tackle this finding?
Yeah, this was my favorite finding of the study. It's the astounding lengths to which people will go to avoid using a chatbot. And what we found is that 3 out of 4 customers would prefer waiting on hold for twice as long as to avoid dealing rather than having a chatbot solve their problem in half the time. And that's especially true for older customers. So what we did was we looked at people's age ranges, how old they are, and we compared this for different generations. And what we found is among baby boomers, 88% would prefer waiting twice as long. And so that's a remarkable statistic, particularly when you consider that in many cases, decision makers, the ones who are really controlling the budget, tend to be older within an organization. You really want to care for that. And so one thing that we need to remember, and I think a lot of folks overlook this, is they spend a lot of time trying to create the best chatbot possible. And it's completely well-intentioned. They're trying to give their customers the best possible experience. But what they overlook is that customer expectations play a tremendous role in the chatbot experience. Meaning, even if you have the best possible chatbot, you've hired copywriters, you've hired a team of psychologists, like you've really mapped this out, you've made it engaging and fun, it doesn't matter because other companies haven't. And so customers are bringing in that expectation of it's going to be a terrible experience, going to waste my time, it's going to be inefficient, and it's not going to solve my problem. And that colors their experience with your chatbot. And so the bottom line from a customer experience is that if your first line of defense is a chatbot, that pretty much communicates to your customers that service is not a priority.
Sylvie, does this mirror what you found working and obviously using chatbots and humans in your experience?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about this one because I do think it's a really interesting part of the study, and I wanted to give thought to, it makes sense to me why people feel this way about chatbots, but is there a space in which chatbots are helpful to the customer experience? And in looking at the way that we use chatbots and the way that customers have given feedback on chatbots, I think that it does not serve as a replacement for human service or touch. Humans are so much better at problem solving, empathy, using judgment. There are things that you just possibly cannot teach a chatbot. Chatbots are really great when it comes to processing and routing information and messages. So in previous slides, we talked about speed being really, really key to building good customer relationships. So chatbots can help you get the right people connected to be responding to the customer. But at the end of the day, you need to make sure that that's followed up with a person who's able to really give the right information, build that empathy, build that trust. And chatbots can be a really helpful way to get to the right person as long as it's not that full replacement of the service experience.
That's awesome. Great insight. Maybe moving on, obviously up front, we think about communication channels all the time. And one of the things we've seen from our customers is that not all channels are created equal. Maybe first, Ron, what did you learn about channels companies and customers are using, and what does that mean for the relationship? And maybe as a follow-up, does email rank highest because it's so ubiquitous?
Well, okay, so you're asking a couple of great questions. So first, let me get into what the channels are that people are using most frequently. So remember, we asked people to identify a vendor with whom they have a great relationship. Then we asked them about that vendor. We really went deep, and we said, how do you communicate with that person most often? And what we found is that email ranks at the top, voice and video calls are a close second. Well, I guess voice is a lot closer. Voice calls, video calls 41, and then face-to-face meeting about 41 as well. What do they not do? They don't communicate on Slack. They don't communicate using chatbots, and they don't really communicate on social media. And again, what that comes down to is that good relationships are defined by personal connections, and it's really difficult to do that unless you have a private one-on-one interaction. That's what builds trust. And if you're communicating through a public forum, by definition, it's going to be harder for you to bond because everything you're saying is visible to others. Now, obviously, that's not true for chatbots. However, it is an extra layer between you and the person, and it's hard to connect when there's an extra layer. It's like trying to deal with someone and having to go through their assistant. Are you gonna have a great relationship with them? No. Is your spouse, you like try doing that with your spouse, right? Here, talk to my assistant. That's not gonna work. Same thing with companies. And so earlier I talked about how companies who are using chat as the front line of their relationships, they're having a tough time building strong relationships. Now, in contrast to that, email is a little bit different. If you think about it, as you point out, it's ubiquitous. You use it all day long. And so we're bringing different expectations to that experience. We have an expectation that email is going to be one-on-one. There's going to be trust. It's going to be efficient. And so will that always be the case? Are chatbots doomed forever? It's hard to predict, but at the moment, it's undoubtedly contributing to the experience. And so email, because it suggests a one-on-one relationship right now, is the most effective approach. At least that's what the data suggests.
Super helpful. Sylvie, obviously, omni-channel is a buzzword in our industry. How do you think about actually deploying, channel preferences and multiple channels in practice?
It's a great question. I think that my philosophy behind this, which ladders in really nicely to what Ron's been talking about here, is meet the customer where they are. Have multiple opportunities for how the customer would like to engage with you, not only because customers have a variety of preferences based on age demographics, based on industry, what their question is, what they want to talk to you about. There are a whole lot of ways that you want to ensure that you can meet customers where they are. We also can see that there probably will be changes in the future. There's the industries are dynamic, people are dynamic, the way they communicate is dynamic. Offering a lot of optionality in multi-channel communication is a really essential way to make sure that your business is set up for success long-term. Some of the trends that we saw in our customers, our younger audiences tend to prefer SMS and social media. Our other industries or older generations definitely do not prefer that style of communication. As we can see, e-commerce might prefer SMS. The best way to really serve your widest client base is really to adopt these multiple channels and giving people access to a lot of ways to work with you. You can also learn, this is all about relationship building. You learn what your customer wants. If they want to be communicated with via email or other channels, you're giving them access to set the stage and for them to decide where to meet them, what makes the most sense for them. So I would think through things like SMS could be the right avenue for brief replies, regular updates, maybe something like, are you able to join this meeting? Email can be more of your formal interactions. WhatsApp is a great tool for international audiences, but you have to make sure that you're bringing all of these different channels together in one place. Otherwise, the customer might feel great and feel like they have a lot of ways to reach you. But if you're not solidifying your side of the relationship by having one channel where you can view all of your interactions with that customer in one place, you've now lost something. You've lost that thread of information. And that's an important part of relationship building, is being able to say, I remember the last time we spoke, it was about X, Y, and Z situation. Let's revisit, or let's continue to build off of that. So I think there's a place for omni-channel when done correctly.
That's awesome. And I see a lot of questions in the Q&A popping up about that. So I'm excited to address them when we get there at the Q&A at the end. But moving on, let's get a little bit more tactical. Obviously, that's a great overview of sort of the research, but how can we put the learnings from the report into action at all of our companies? First, I'm curious, Ron, what tips do you have for the audience?
So for this question, what we ask people is we put a variety of different things that a vendor might do when communicating with a client. And we said, if a vendor were to do the following, would that improve your impression of their service, or would that hurt your impression of their service? And so what we're looking for is not, is it efficient? Is it helpful? It's what does it do to the impression? And so what we found are, these are the top 6 things that you can do to improve customers' impression of your service. Number 1, acknowledge receiving your customer's message after it's received. 2, offer your direct contact information. Obviously, it's not always going to be possible, but if you can do it, that goes a long way towards establishing trust and making it easy for them to communicate with you. Use your customer's first name in the interaction. That goes to demonstrate a connection, right? And so if you're calling them, Mr. Friedman, as opposed to Ron, there's a level of formality that can get in the way of forming a relationship. Most customers prefer being called by their first name. Send a summary email after your interaction, repeat back the problem to ensure you understand their needs, and finally, occasionally offer advice and recommendations. Now, one thing that was on here that didn't make this list, which I think is important, was expressing empathy in the person's situation. And the fact that, in fact, it was toward the bottom. It was like toward the bottom of things that people said would improve their impression of a vendor, a service provider. And I think what that tells us is that empathy, while valuable in certain circumstances, has really been abused in the customer service arena. And I think we've all had the experience of calling our cell phone provider and saying, hey, my calls are being dropped or something of that nature. And the service provider, who you don't know, who you don't have a relationship with, just meeting for the first time is like, oh, we're so sorry to hear that. And I think that it can rub people the wrong way if it's ineffective. And so I'm raising that because I think it's something we need to think about as we map out the way we communicate with customers. Is you can use empathy, but only if it rings true and doesn't sound inauthentic.
That's awesome. Super helpful and great advice. I'm curious, you have some advice sort of beyond just the interaction itself to actually make that experience even better. Curious to have you walk through some of these.
Yeah, so here in this question, the previous question we asked people to discuss ways in which they'd like, how would it affect your impression of the vendor while you're working with them? In this question, we went further and we asked them, let's say you're not working with a vendor on a project, which of the following would hurt or help the impression of the vendor? And so these are things you can do when you are not directly working with the client on a project. And so number one, proactively reach out to see if they need any help. 2, send articles that are relevant to their business, send a monthly newsletter with useful information, send occasional books that are relevant to your customer's industry, ask for the customer's advice. That's an interesting one. Like, we don't often think about that, but being asked for your opinion, it implies that you are an intelligent, smart person. So it's an interesting way of gaining trust, right? If you're complimenting someone, even if it's not direct, if it's an indirect compliment, that can be effective. And then lastly, ask if there's anything else you can do to help. Now, this final point here you see on the right with the 2 bells is the frequent updates. This actually is a reference to when you are working with a customer, and what customers prefer is give them a choice. Do you prefer frequent updates, or do you prefer that the vendor hold on to lots of information but give it to you at once so it's not wasting your time? So again, what we're seeing is something that is valuable to customers but actually takes up more of their time. And so what they actually prefer are more frequent updates rather than just a batched information dump, because even though that would be more efficient, right? That's how CEOs like to have all their information delivered to them. That's not how customers think. They want frequent interactions because it helps reduce their anxiety and helps reassure them that the problem is being solved.
That's super interesting. I'm curious, Sylvie, does this resonate with your experience? And do you have any other strategies you feel like outside of the communication itself to make the experience even better?
Yeah, this was the part of the research that was most exciting to me because I think it's the hardest to nail down. And customers expect, if they have a renewal, if they reach out to you and they need help, they have a lot of expectations around what that experience is going to look like. You have a lot of expectations as the service provider of what you're supposed to do and what that playbook looks like. But the real ways that relationships are built are outside of the expected moments and really in these surprise and delight moments where you're reaching out, you're thinking of the customer. And one of the examples that I use with my team is you get cards on your birthday, you get cards for different holidays that you're expecting. They make you feel good. All of that is great. Some of the most meaningful experiences that I have in friendships or relationships with my family is when you get a card from someone that says, hey, I was thinking about you, or I read this article and it made me think about you. There's something about that unexpected outreach to know that you're on someone's mind, they care about you, they care about your experience, that can really make a difference. So I thought that these were just phenomenal recommendations. Overall, we know that increasing the number of touches is going to be essential in relationship building. So I think make it easy for your teams, create templates for them in order to be able to easily conduct this type of information, set metrics or recommendations to say, send one book a month is your goal to customers as you think about them, or an article once every 6 weeks. Try to make it something that you're able to maintain and easier for your team to be able to actually implement. But these types of touches, you build them into your life cycle, and it can really make a difference with the customer long term.
That's awesome advice. I think you also found some things not to do, Ron. Curious, what do customers not appreciate from the companies they're doing business with?
So these are things that everyone needs to watch out for. And remember, we talked about things that would either elevate or decrease people's impression of the service you provide. And so these are the things that were near the bottom. So one is, don't use phrases that sound unnatural or scripted. This is the danger of trying to scale, right? Like you have SOPs and you have direct dialogue that people can use within their chats or within their conversations, less their conversations, but more in their chats and their emails. And it's really important to consider whether or not it's going to come across as scripted, because that's one of the quickest paths to undermining the service you provide, is if you come across as inauthentic. And this also speaks to the empathy point that we talked about earlier. Don't send Facebook friendship requests. Now, LinkedIn requests, they're welcome. Facebook, something about Facebook that implies that you are closer than LinkedIn, those are not appreciated. And finally, don't include GIFs in your emails. Now, interestingly, we did find that people appreciate humor from a vendor that elevates perception, but GIFs, there's a level of immaturity, perhaps, or implied closeness that, again, rubs people the wrong way. So again, think about it as they want relatedness, they want closeness, they want responsiveness, but they don't want someone who's going to be their best friend. That's not what your job is. Don't even attempt it.
Gifts like this, and I guess we're also violating the humor here, but wanted to just ask, obviously, Sylvie, with Halloween right around the corner, do you have any sort of horror stories to share, either in these three areas or something else?
Sure, I have many, but I have one that stands out to me that I like to teach my team and share with them what this experience felt like for me. We had purchased a software, this was many years ago, we purchased a software and we were running into issues with getting the amount of service and product attention that we needed. It was a complex piece of tooling and we just were not getting the ROI that we were expecting. And I had escalated this issue into the vendor's management team. And the response that I got back from them is, we have customers who are Jupiter, who are Mars, and who are Pluto. You're a Pluto customer, therefore we're not able to further invest in getting success to you. And that was a bad feeling for many reasons. One, of course, being that my problem was not going to be solved, which never feels good, especially when you're paying for a service and you know that you're never going to see the ROI. But being told that I didn't matter and my company's business didn't matter left a really bad taste in my mouth. And there are so many ways that you can communicate that, or there are limited resources. You're not always able to do everything for your customers. Saying no is okay. We have a blog post about saying no to customers. It's a really important step in the customer journey at times, but making your customer feel unimportant or like you don't value their business is a huge, huge no-no, and definitely a way to really alienate that relationship.
Super, super helpful. Something on my mind, and I'm sure a lot of yours, what is the outlook for the economy and how will it affect people on customer facing teams? I think it's a super important point. I'm curious, Ron, what did your research find about how people are looking at the economy?
So this is research, I want to remind everyone, that was conducted in July. So we asked people, do you think the economy is going to improve? Is it headed for a downturn, or is it going to stay the same? Most people said 40%, in fact, said that the economy is headed for a downturn. And that was especially pronounced among older respondents. So the older the respondent, the more likely they were saying the economy is headed for a downturn. And obviously that was prescient. In the case of baby boomers, 51% said it was going to get worse. Whereas with Gen Z and millennials, it was 21% and 33%. Respectively. And so that's likely because people who are older have experienced this before. They've seen this before. They've lived it. And so they're able to detect the signs a little bit more effectively. And so what that tells us is that, when you couple the fact that most people perceive the economy is going to slow down, and then there's another finding here to the right, which is what do you think happens when the economy slows? What is the impact on customer service? Well, most people think that when the economy slows, customer service deteriorates. When you take those two together, most people think the economy is headed for a downturn. And obviously, given that it's not July anymore, we're in October, these numbers are likely to be much higher now. So most people think the economy is headed for a downturn. We also saw that when the economy heads for a downturn, customer service plummets. What that suggests is an opportunity, because the bar is so much lower for anticipated customer service. If you can stand out on customer service, that suggests you're really going to impress people.
Super helpful. Sylvie, you've led teams through downturns before. What have you learned about service expectations in your experience during these times?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because service expectations don't tend to make a big downturn with the downturn in economy, yet service teams tend to be some of the teams that are the first cut. And it's a really interesting conundrum, because they're not viewed as revenue drivers. It can be an easy area to make a cut during a downturn. But I think it's a really careful decision that needs to be made, because there's lean revenue and expensive revenue. Recurring revenue, your existing customers, are so much more important to retain versus acquiring a new customer. I think most statistics show it's about 10x more expensive to acquire someone new. And people at times forget about that and look at some of the short-term gains versus the long-term plan. I would recommend doubling down on fighting revenue churn during these types of time periods versus cutting teams and cutting headcount. And I'd recommend not cutting service levels. Their expectations are not going to change due to a reduction in the market. Your customers still expect the same from you. And when you make those types of changes, they can be really damaging long-term. You have a few bad experiences. It's probably been 10 years, and I still think about that planet analogy that was used. You need to be really cautious in how much of a risk you're willing to take on. And from an employee retention perspective, unemployment's still low. The cash market's tight, but if you start doing things like increasing your portfolio size, giving people more responsibility, or responsibility that doesn't feel in line with their job, you might start to run into an employee retention issue as well. So you need to think about the long-term implications of a cut. You could start losing your staff, you could start losing your customers, and it can be really difficult to unwind and rebuild once some of those decisions are made.
Super, super great advice. Thank you so much. Maybe finally, I think it's fitting a report called "The Science Behind Strong Customer Relationships" should end with some thoughts about data and measurement. Sylvie, obviously being on the ground and being so operational for so many years, like, what are the best ways to benchmark your improvement when it comes to your customers?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because there are a few ways that you can look at benchmarking. You can look at the reaction, which is more of our traditional metrics for customer relationship management, things like CSAT and NPS, which are great metrics to benchmark, but they all happen after customer interaction. And at that point, you can't improve the interaction. You have to wait until the next one. You don't necessarily know why there was a negative interaction or why it was a positive interaction. And it also requires the customer to choose to respond, which doesn't always happen. And you tend to end up with either the really positive stories or the really negative stories, but your baseline is not easily captured in these types of metrics. So it's really helpful to look at metrics that might be a bit more proactive and a bit more of a leading indicator for you. Things like resolution time, the time between your inbound outreach and the time that you close the issue. We found in our data and research that the leading indicator for a high CSAT, which is customer satisfaction score, is fast resolution time, which absolutely ladders right into Ron's analysis at the beginning of this conversation as well. Fast resolution time is really critical. You can track it passively with no opt-in from the customer, and it's something that you can track every single interaction. So you can start to find trends, bottlenecks, even reps that you may need to work with from an improvement perspective. So that's an important area. There are kind of two components that make up response time. One is handle time, the time between the first time the customer reaches out to you and when you resolve it. There's also response quality, which can be measured through things like the number of messages that it took to respond, how many back and forths you had, et cetera. So it's an important area. And we have a customer, Branch Insurance, who was able to increase their CSAT score from 85% to 90%, which, as we know by law of percentages, is a major increase. They did it because they had things like they checked on SLA breaches. How long had it been since they had responded to the customer? And it helped them reduce their response time by 75%, which led to this increase in CSAT. So that quick response of getting back to the customer and getting back to them with the right answer is a really, really essential way to drive those metrics up. And it's a great area to track.
Great advice. Super helpful. Thanks so much to both of you. Before we get to questions, and please submit your questions. I'm going to start looking through them here. I want to give you both for any final thoughts. Let's start with Ron.
Yeah, so we have another finding that I think is important to note. Remember, we asked people to analyze the good vendor relationships they have in their lives and the poor vendor relationships they have in their lives. And we asked them a whole host of questions about those vendors. And one of the questions was, to what extent do you feel like the vendor knows you personally? And what we found is that in good, strong vendor relationships, in 70% of instances, people feel like the vendor knows them personally. If you look at the poor vendor relationships, only 33% said the vendor knows them personally. And so what that tells us really is that when you have a close personal connection, you are fueling people's psychological need for relatedness. And again, we touched on psychological needs. I'll say a little bit more about that now. All of us, all human beings, regardless of age, gender, culture, we all have three basic human psychological needs. Those psychological needs are the need for relatedness, so feeling connected, valued, and appreciated by others. That's what we're talking about here. And there are two other needs. One is the need for mastery, feeling like you're growing and good at what you do. And then finally, the need for autonomy. So feeling like you have some choice in how you go about living your life. And when we have those basic human psychological needs fulfilled, we tend to be healthier, happier, and more productive. What we're finding here is that when vendors look at the relationship they have with their customers through the lens of relatedness, when they provide things like, quick turnaround, to Sylvie's point, when they acknowledge people's concerns, when they respond quickly, when they make interacting with them easier, and when they provide frequent updates, those are the things that really fuel that psychological need for relatedness. And within our report, we actually have some evidence for autonomy and mastery as well, but today we're focusing on relatedness. But when you look at it through the lens of what people really desire in human relationships, that opens up really all these new opportunities for thinking about what our customer is going to respond well to, and how can we start doing that in a unique, branded way within our organization. And so I'm excited by that finding because I think it really speaks to the importance of psychological needs, even as they extend to business relationships.
That's great. Sylvie, final thoughts.
Final thoughts here, and this is probably a selfish thought given the position that I'm in, but I have to imagine lots of people on this call are probably in similar positions. Human relationships still really matters. I think that in the industry, there are a lot of ways, a lot of things to automate, a lot of areas to create automation and efficiency. But at the end of the day, people want to interact with people. They want to build relationships, even at a business level. And I was really happy to see that in the findings, and definitely it aligns with the experience that I've had in the industry as well. There's something that you just can't replace that human touch with. You can elevate it with technology, but it's an elevation, not a replacement.
Super valuable. Great. Okay, thanks to Ron and Sylvie. We'll open it up for Q&A, but obviously first we're going to actually launch a quick poll, and it's really about more just getting a sense of, is there someone that you would like to talk to up front more about this research? It's for us, and that way we can reach out if you are. But I think there's a lot of interesting findings here. I can see from the questions and answers, we have a ton of interest, not only in the research, but just basic, how do we better benchmark and measure things like, Stephen, I'm not sure we're going to get to your question, but it's a great one. What's the difference between resolution time and handle time? And obviously, Front is a great product and can measure these types of things for you, and we can walk you through sort of how to think that through in a little bit more of a detailed way. So we'll keep the poll open for a second more, but there's a clear question that everybody would like to know. I'm going to switch back and see if I can find the slide here. I think it was on this slide. And the question, maybe I'll first ask for Ron. Everybody wants to know, where does SMS fall on this chart? Obviously, we have most frequently used channels in a good customer relationship and least frequently used. SMS is going to be somewhere in the middle. I think Sylvie touched on it quite a bit from an operational perspective, that she loves to have it for quicker answers, easier, simple things, and also age demographics. But curious if you had any other findings or thoughts around SMS.
Fifth. That's the answer, is fifth. So we have the top 4 and the bottom 3. It's fifth. But what's interesting about text messaging, I also have a breakdown here, and you would think there might be generational difference, but there aren't. It's just fifth all across the board for all generations.
Interesting. That's super helpful. Any data that you had on how texting relates to relationship satisfaction, or any ideas there?
That would require a different level of analysis than I have available to me here. But I think that, and again, I want to restate the question that this speaks to, because what we ask people is, how do you communicate most frequently with the best vendors? So just because they're not communicating through text message doesn't mean that earlier I said it's fifth in preference. It's not. I misstated. I misspoke. It's fifth most frequent in terms of how often they're communicating using different channels. Now, what's their preference for using text messaging? Let's go to the next question. I'm going to search for that. I think I might have that.
No problem. The next question, again, I think is on channels. I'm going to try to find the slide here. I believe it's this one. Yeah. On chatbots, we talked a lot about chatbots, and that seems fairly clear in terms of the indication. But I'm curious, and there's quite a bit of questions here. What about human chat versus chatbots? And maybe I'll toss this one to Sylvie. How do you think about the chat channel in relation? Obviously, that's live chat, not just chatbot.
Yeah, I really enjoy live chat, and I think that it's something that we have found a lot of success with for specific conversations. I think it really matters what you're talking about. If you're trying to explain something complex, something that requires empathy, et cetera, live chat's not typically a great recommendation and not something that I would suggest to utilize. But I think it's a phenomenal tool. If it's a quick hit, quick response, it gets the customer what they need. They're still talking to a person if it's those one-offs. So I like to have multiple avenues available. And I think live chat is great, especially when you're dealing with a support specific question, not just customer experience or customer success, but support related. Live chat is one of our customers' favorite ways to interact.
That's great. Super helpful. And maybe one more, Sylvie, while we have you up, there is one question, in regards to sort of like customer service and providing this great customer service. Emily asked, that seems really hard to scale. How do you do that, via customer success versus customer support? And sort of related as a follow-on question, like, do you believe people will pay more to work with a human?
I do, and I've seen that happen. It's not something that we do at Front, but it's something that I've done at other companies. And at first I had a lot of mixed feelings about it. I felt like it wasn't right to be charging for service, et cetera. And then I realized it was something that our customers wanted and requested, and actually were asking for. If we want a deeper level of interaction, can we pay for that? Can we add on ways of working with you? So I think that there are certainly areas where that makes a lot of sense for customers who might want more hand-holding, more of a deep dive, et cetera. It's definitely something that customers are willing to pay for. Customer success and support, it's a constant discussion of where's the line between the two. I think you can almost think of the channels in which you would interact as proxies to the type of question and type of relationship that's more customer success versus support. So there are rare circumstances in which a customer success, customer experience representative should be having an interaction over SMS or live chat, because most of those conversations are about relationship building long-term, delivering ROI to the customer, sharing best practices, proactively reaching out and delivering information to that customer, whereas support is a reactive function that tends to be best accomplished over email or live chat. And it is a one-off conversation. It's not typically something that's ongoing. It's not something where you need to necessarily know a whole host of information about the customer. You should have some level of information going into it, but that tends to be the way that I think about that in my mind, and those differences.
Super, super helpful. I think we only have time for probably a couple more questions. I'll ask one more for Sylvie, and then we'll flip over for one for Ron. Sylvie, the question from Jonathan, this is actually the first question that's asked. Do you think economic environment changes what vendors, buyers care about? So, based on layoffs and budget restrictions right now in tech, would those customers teams switch their preference on the money time savings finding? And I'll pull that up. I think it was just this one, that most people would prefer the best service, even if it costs slightly more. Do you see that changing as economic conditions change and force tighter budgets? Or do you think that this is recession proof?
I think that likely goes back into the ROI piece. So if it is something that feels like a nice to have for the customer, it can easily get cut and easily be one of the first things to go as a part of a market downturn. If it's something that you can demonstrate ROI, if they have the relationship and it's already built, I see it as something that people will keep and will want to invest in and continue to value. If it's something where it feels like fluff or you have an added value, I think it's definitely an area that could be very, very quickly cut. So
that's great, Ron.
Cut out for you.
Yeah, Ron. Any thoughts here? Obviously, as you're looking at the research and the landscape.
Yeah, I think this is really a question that touches on the difference between acquisition versus retention. So when customers are in an acquisition mindset, they're going to prioritize cost a lot more than they are going to later on, right? Later on, customer service becomes a lot more important. And so I'm often reminded of the classic example of like why people join a gym. In many cases, they'll join a gym because it has some really cool amenities, but they'll only renew their membership if they've developed relationships with people at the gym. So if you try to sell them on relationships, it's like, what? I don't need that. I'm trying to find a fancy treadmill or whatever. So there are different elements that people prioritize in different parts of the customer journey. And so that's why earlier when I talking about customer service, it's really important to highlight the importance of customer service, because the customer may not know enough when they're making the buying decision about why better customer service is important. So you really got to lay that out in a way that frames it as a gain, not a loss. So in other words, you don't want to say our software is so complicated that you're really going to want to get on the phone with us, right? You want to talk about the shorter time to getting the outcome that they're looking for, that sort of thing, where you're framing it as gains as opposed to losses.
Super, super helpful. This is going to be our final question. I know we're 5 minutes over, but thanks to the folks who have stayed on the line and are still submitting questions. If we don't get to you, we'll try to answer you asynchronously. But this one is a great one, and there's a couple themes, a couple questions about this theme. But the question is, what would be an ideal balance of sending less updates with more information versus sending more updates, but possibly having not as much information to share? Is it worth it to send an update to let a customer know that you still don't have an update? And I believe this was actually, I'll pull up the slide, but it's about, the actual, how to make it experience any better, proactively reaching out, and also the slide before, making sure that you acknowledge receiving the question. Maybe I'll start with Sylvie here.
Sure. I think it's a really good question, first off, and it brings up an important point for this slide and for other topics of conversation, which is you have to ensure that you are adding value or building a relationship with every communication that you have with a customer. Once a customer starts to receive a handful of emails, messages, et cetera, that are not of value or of interest to them, where they haven't learned something, they haven't built a relationship, or it doesn't add any value to the way that they're running their business, they start to ignore your messages. So I wouldn't advocate for sending a whole bunch of information that you don't really think anyone's going to care about, or mass sending information. That tends to be the quickest thing. It's very rare that you're sending something directly to a customer where you've thought about them and you're telling them something that you think could be interesting to them, and that's ignored. It's more so you're sending it to your entire book of business, all of your customers on a repeated basis. That's where it starts to become overwhelming. If the customer has an outstanding issue or outstanding question that you're working on, I absolutely advocate for sending a holding reply or saying something along the lines of, I don't have an update for you, but this is where your situation stands. Because in the silence, people assume you've forgotten. And I'm sure that we all have had many experiences where we have been forgotten, and it's on us to continue. So we're leaving the burden of the customer by letting them know that you're still advocating for them, you're still following up, but you don't have anything to say. No updates yet, I think, is important, but I wouldn't advocate for just to reach out to do a quick check-in. That's something that can be a pet peeve for customers. You need to bring them something, be proactive, and be adding something to their day.
Ron, maybe some final thoughts here. Is there too much? Is it too frequent update?
I think I agree with everything that Sylvie said. And I would say, this is a testable question. As a researcher, I think about all the factors that might go into it. So here's some things that you might want to consider. Number one, the type of customer, the person, the archetypal personality of your target audience. What kind of person is that? Does that kind of person like frequent updates? Or do they not like frequent updates? Depends on your industry, depends on your product. There's a lot that goes into that. Then there's the factor of the level of urgency. How important is this to their business, to their job, to the outcomes they're trying to achieve? And finally, has something gone wrong, or are they trying to add something? Because that sort of framework can really help you think about the number of updates. So if something's gone wrong, they're likely going to want more updates than if it's just a feature they're trying to add. So those are all ideas of where to get started, but ultimately this is something that I'd probably want to test.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody so much. As I said, we have way more questions than we could potentially get to, and I'm really excited about this research. A number of folks asked. You can get the full report downloaded on our website, and that's got methodology and all sorts of other things in it. And as I said, we'll be following up via email with this recording as well. So a number of folks commented that they couldn't see the whole thing. We'll get you the recording so you can see it all. Thank you all for joining, and we really appreciate it. Talk to you soon. Bye.